Welcome to History Explorers, a program brought to you by the Sons of the American Revolution, Ozark Mountain Chapter. I'm Howard Fisk, and I invite you to join us as we explore characters of the Spanish-American War. When we finish, we hope that you'll get a library book or two and become a history explorer along with us. America became interested in Spanish Cuba when revolution broke out on the little island just 90 miles off the Florida coast. Spain was also suffering from revolutionary outbreaks in their other western possessions as well. Florida and West Florida were Spanish territories, along with Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and the island of Guam. When we purchased the Louisiana Territory, we had conflicts with Mexico and Spain in the southwest. The Spanish Empire in the Western Hemisphere was considered a threat to America unless we controlled those Spanish islands. The Spanish considered their holdings important because of the vast sugarcane plantations and rum distilleries on Puerto Rico, tobacco and pineapple in Cuba, sugarcane, rice, bananas, pineapples, and mangoes in the Philippines. These Spanish colonies in the Western Hemisphere offered peace, prosperity, and well-located strategic partners for the United States as a new territory if we could trade with these islands peacefully. Tonight we will offer brief outlines of some of the significant military leaders who made an impact on the outcome of the Spanish-American War. These men helped make America a colonial power.
Mention the Spanish-American War today, and you'll probably receive blank stares, although some might remember the war thanks to Teddy Roosevelt and the charge up San Juan Hill. This is really unfortunate because there's far more to the war than Teddy Roosevelt. The Spanish-American War was America's first overseas war and marked America's entry on the world stage. After the end of the Civil War in 1865, Americans largely looked inward, focused on industry and manufacturing, along with seizing control of the American West from Native Americans. But a revolution broke out in Cuba in 1895 as the Cubans sought to win their independence from the Spanish Empire. The Spanish brutally suppressed the revolution, rounding up Cubans to place in detention camps where thousands died. Americans naturally felt sympathy for the Cubans as they had fought for their own freedom in the War of Independence from Great Britain, and there were significant U.S. business interests in Cuba, particularly sugar refining. In November 1896, William McKinley was elected President of the United States. McKinley was a Civil War combat veteran, so he knew how brutal wars could be, and he tried to avoid American intervention in the Cuban Revolution. That all changed on February 15, 1898. The battleship USS Maine was sitting in Havana Harbor. At 9:40 that night, a huge explosion ripped the ship apart, killing or mortally wounding 266 sailors and Marines. Americans were outraged as they experienced something similar to a 9/11 moment. A Navy investigation into the sinking concluded that an external explosion caused the disaster, leading many to assume that a Spanish mine had destroyed the ship. "Remember the Maine" became a rallying cry across the nation. McKinley continued to try to avoid war, but on April 25th, after Spain refused the American demand to withdraw from Cuba and declare Cuban independence, the United States declared war on Spain. So how could we defeat the Spanish Empire, which was spread across the globe? Americans would have to attack Guam, Puerto Rico, and more importantly, Cuba and the Philippines. Let's look at the Philippines first. U.S. Commodore George Dewey was located in Hong Kong with part of the American Navy when the war began. Dewey moved quickly to the Philippines and sailed into Manila Bay on the morning of May 1st, 1898. His ships attacked the Spanish fleet there, took time out for breakfast, then returned for a second pass to destroy the Spanish. No Americans were killed, and only 9 were wounded in the battle. It was an incredible victory for the Americans, as the Spanish Pacific Fleet was now at the bottom of Manila Bay, and Dewey became a national hero. Lieutenant John Ellicott wrote this about the battle. "Everybody was already up, all peering through the mist of the morning. On some ships, a little coffee had been served, but on all, the men were without breakfast. The stars and stripes broke from every staff and masthead in our squadron. The battle now commenced in earnest, and both squadrons were enshrouded in dense white billows of smoke. ever increasing in volume and incessantly pierced by red tongues of flame, while the heavy, jarring reports of great guns, the scream of projectiles, and the sharp bursting of shells added the awful majesty of terrific noise to the vivid grandeur of fire and smoke. In that stubborn combat of 2.5 hours, the Spanish ships fought like beasts at bay. The pall of smoke which hung between the contending vessels prevented the effect of many shots from being seen, but close scrutiny with glasses gave the comforting assurance after the first 20 minutes that the enemy was being hit hard and repeatedly, and as the range grew less so that the guns' crews could watch the fall of their shots with the naked eye, many a cheer went up from every ship. Naked to the waist and grimy with the soot of powder, their heads bound up in water-soaked towels, sweat running in rivulets over their glistening bodies, these men swung shell after shell and charge after charge, each weighing 100 to 250 pounds, into their huge guns, and trained these monster engines of destruction, 15 to 20 tons, all under a tropical sun, utterly unconscious of fatigue and oblivious of the fact that each and every one of them was in momentary danger of being mangled. Even greater was the endurance of those below decks, behind watertight doors, facing the white heat of furnace fires and breathing an atmosphere at 200 degrees, knowing not the tide of battle, knowing not if the shocks which continually shook their ships were from their own guns or the enemy's shells, but knowing full well that for themselves, in case of disaster, there was no escape, but death amid the horrors of scalding steam, searing fire, and inrushing water. Dewey wrote this in a letter to his son. Long before you receive this, you will have heard of our brilliant victory on May 1st. I doubt if any naval victory was more complete than ours. The Secretary of the Navy sent a telegram to Dewey that said, "The President, in the name of the American people, thanks you and your officers and men for your splendid achievement and overwhelming victory." It truly was a great victory, but in fact, Dewey did not have enough sailors and Marines to capture the city of Manila. He would have to wait until American soldiers sailed across the Pacific to join his fleet before he could truly capture the Philippines. Let's leave the Philippines for now and have a look at the war in Cuba. The major question there was where to attack. The logical choice was Havana, but it really depended on where the Spanish Atlantic Fleet was located. Eventually, it was sited in Santiago, so the Americans assembled a huge invasion force in Tampa, Florida. Nearly 17,000 men sailed from Tampa, and on June 22nd, they landed at Daiquiri on the Cuban coast. They moved west toward the San Juan Heights, a series of hills that guarded Santiago. On July 1st, the Americans began their attack on the San Juan Heights. Buffalo soldiers, Colonel Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders, and other American troops eventually pushed the Spanish off the heights. Charles Johnson Post, a New York soldier, wrote this about moving up to the attack. The jungle trail into which we had been ordered was as narrow as a cowpath. We were aware of a coolness and a shadowy dimness freckled with sunshine. Yet this did not lessen the sense of those thin, seething sounds that streaked through the jungle. We walked through a light shower of snipped-off twigs and leaves fluttering in lazy spirals to the ground. It seemed that if one stuck out his hand, his fingers would be clipped off. We huddled within ourselves and bent over to shield our bellies. Overhead, a shell burst, like the popping of a blown-up paper bag. Another shell burst lower, and George Featherstone caught a glancing fragment of iron that shattered his shoulder blade. That shell, we heard, got 12 men, including George. Beside me, I heard a dull, muffled chonk, and a man clutched his knee and grunted. We heard a command, hard and sharp. It was an officer. Go on, he said. Don't stop for the wounded. Get on. They'll be taken care of. Although San Juan Heights was captured, the city did not surrender, and the Spanish fleet was still in the harbor. On July 3rd, that fleet tried to escape the harbor, and the naval battle of Santiago was on. American ships quickly gave chase, and in the battle, the Spanish lost every vessel and had 323 men killed, 151 wounded, and 1,720 captured. Only one American sailor was killed, and none of the American ships suffered significant damage. Outside Santiago, the American forces sat and waited for the Spanish to surrender the city. Charles Post wrote about what daily life was like. We soaked our hardtack in water till it swelled up to the size of a fat dog biscuit. Then we fried it in what grease we had. Occasionally some Cubans might pass, and we traded hardtack for mangoes. But we did have coffee, green and unroasted, just as it had come from the coffee plantations. We fried it in our mess tins, and it charred to black on one side and remained its natural green on the other. Then we pounded it into broken bits in our cups using bayonets we had picked up. Then we boiled it. The result was a dishwater-colored liquid. Its only resemblance to coffee was that it was hot. Finally, on July 17th, Santiago surrendered. "We gave 3 cheers," said Private Post. "I was lucky. I had survived." On the other side of the world, an American army finally reached Commodore Dewey in Manila, and that city surrendered on August 14th. With Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico under American control, the Spanish agreed to a truce. On December 10th, the Americans and Spanish signed the Treaty of Paris, ending the war. Spain gave Cuba its freedom, gave Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States, and repaid $20 million for the Philippines. A total of 306,760 Americans served in the war, with 385 battle deaths and 2,061 deaths by disease, accidents, or other causes. So what did Missouri contribute to the war? Like most volunteer units, 5 of Missouri's 6 infantry regiments stayed in the United States during the Spanish-American War, but they lost men from diseases like typhoid that swept through their camps. The 6th Missouri went to Cuba as occupation troops, while Battery A, Missouri Volunteer Artillery, went to Puerto Rico. Just as they were in position, ready to open fire on the Spanish, an order was received telling them to cease fire, as the Spanish had surrendered. With the peace treaty signed, America was now a world power with possessions around the world. The splendid little war, as Secretary of State John Hay called it, had given the United States an empire.
Hello, I'm Colonel Theodore Roosevelt. I was born in New York City on October 27, 1858. My father was a businessman and philanthropist. I remember a tense time in my childhood during the Civil War. My father was a staunch Union man and worked tirelessly with President Lincoln to improve the living conditions of the Union soldiers and their families, while my mother, my aunt, grandmother, all Southern ladies, lived with us. They would secretly send care packages to their relatives behind enemy lines. I also suffered from severe asthma during my childhood. My father would take me on long carriage rides to force air into my lungs when my asthma was severe. He also taught me the importance of physical fitness and took me on several outdoor and hunting trips. I was homeschooled, but I started my college career at Harvard University in the fall of 1876. My father passed away in 1878, and I felt as if my world had collapsed around me. I persevered, however, and finished, after a rough start, in June of 1880, ranked 21 in my class and graduated cum laude with a bachelor's degree in history and government. After graduating Harvard, I enrolled in the Columbia University School of Law. I was thoroughly bored with the practice of law, and I dropped out after the first semester. I did use this time, however, to write my first book, The History of the Naval War in 1812. Little did I know at the time how much this would affect my life in the future. It was my senior year at Harvard that I met the love of my life, Alice Hathaway Lee, in October of 1879. We were married on my 22nd birthday, October 27th, 1880. Alice died on February 14th, 1884, 2 days after giving birth to our first child. My mother also died on that same day, just 12 hours before my wife died, in the same house. I was so greatly distressed at the death of both my mother and my wife that I did not run for re-election in the New York State Legislature, and I left for a trip to South Dakota Territory. Here I purchased a cattle ranch with some of the inheritance that I had received from my father. It was here that I started writing my second book, The Winning of the West. In 1886, after a drought and blizzard decimated my herd, I returned to New York to enter into the world of politics again. Although I lost the election as mayor of New York, I had met up with an old childhood friend named Edith Kermit Crow, whom I married on December 2nd, 1886. Together we had 5 children between 1887 and 1897. That was really kind of when my political career really took off. I was appointed to the 4-man Civil Commission by President Benjamin Harrison in 1889, where I was successful in instigating many reforms in government. I left this post to become Police Commissioner of New York City in 1895, where I implemented many reforms on the promotion and appointment system to be based on merit rather than on patronage. During this time, I campaigned vigorously for presidential candidate William McKinley. Upon his election, I was appointed to the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1896. I strongly felt that the United States was headed to war with Spain. So I did everything I could to get the Navy ready for what I thought was an impending war. My feelings were justified when the battleship USS Maine suddenly exploded and sank in the Havana harbor, killing 262 sailors. Shortly thereafter, war was declared on Spain. I immediately resigned my post of Assistant Secretary of the Navy and petitioned Secretary of War Alger to allow me to form a regiment of volunteers. I recommended an old friend, Colonel Leonard Wood, to serve as regimental commander, and I would serve under him as a lieutenant colonel. Together, we began recruiting and organizing the first U.S. volunteer cavalry, which became known as the Rough Riders. We put together this ragtag group of polo players, hunters, cowboys, Native Americans, and athletic college buddies. We began training near San Antonio, Texas, for our eventual deployment to the island of Cuba. I supplied my men with khaki uniforms instead of the traditional wool uniforms of the time. I was sure this would be more suitable in the sweltering heat of the Cuban islands. Another distinctive part of our uniform was the blue bandana with small white dots. We trained hard and departed for Tampa, Florida, where we would depart for Cuba. After much delay, we were able to board the transport ship Yucatan. And on June 13th, we departed for Cuba, where we received the order to land on June the 22nd. The landing went on without a fight by the Spanish, which was good, because the landing was not well planned. There was not enough boats, and many men drowned because they were dropped off too far from shore with heavy equipment. We did, however, land, and we were prepared to fight. By the next afternoon, we began our assault on Los Squasamus. In the battle, which lasted for 1.5 hours, we lost 8 men, including Captain Allen Capron, Jr., a 5th-generation military man, whom I had previously called the best military man in the regiment, and Sergeant Hamilton Fish, the son of a prominent New York family. We also suffered 34 wounded. I was very lucky that I was not killed during this skirmish, as a bullet struck a tree that I was peeking out from behind, and it shot splinters of dust into my eyes. During the battle, the Civil War commander, General Joe Wheeler, who was quite elderly at the time, was laid low by the excitement, efforts, and fever. This caused Colonel Leonard Wood to be promoted to the brigade commander and the rank of brigadier general, and I would be promoted to regimental commander and the rank of colonel. I finally had my own regiment, and what a regiment it was. The heat was unbearable, but because of our training, we were able to push on. On June 30th, the temperature reached over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. We were ordered by General Wood to ford the San Juan River when a Spanish artillery shell burst directly over our heads, causing a piece of shrapnel to hit my wrist. We were then ordered to advance up Kettle Hill. The most serious loss that I had, and that the regiment had, could have suffered just before we charged. Captain Bucky O'Neill was strolling up and down in front of his men smoking a cigarette, and he was terribly addicted to the habit. He had a theory that an officer ought to never take cover, a theory that was obviously wrong. Though in a volunteer organization, the officers should certainly expose themselves very fully, simply for the effect on the men. A regimental toast, I remember, on the transport over was, "The officers, may the war last until each is killed, wounded, or promoted." As he moved around, his men begged him to lie down, and he made the comment that there had not been a Spanish bullet invented yet that would kill him. A few minutes later, after discussing with another regimental officer the direction which the Spanish fire was coming from, he turned around and a bullet struck him in the mouth, came out the back of his head, killing him. My orderly was a brave young Harvard boy named Sanders from Salem, Massachusetts. The heat finally overcame him. He dropped and did not recover, and he later died from fever. In his place, I summoned a trooper whose name I don't recall, shortly after I had directed him to go back and ask the first general that he came across if I could advance, as my men were being cut up. As he stood up to salute, he fell over my knees, a bullet having gone through his throat, severing his carotid artery. I had sent several messengers to find General Sumner or General Wood and get permission to advance when Lieutenant Colonel Dorst came riding up through the storm of bullets with the welcome command to move forward and support the regulars in the assault on the hills to our front. The instant I received the order, I sprang on my horse, and then my crowded hour began. I started in the rear of the regiment, the position in which a colonel should theoretically stay. Captain Mills and Captain McCormick were both with me as aides, and I had to send them off on special duty in getting different bodies of men moving forward. I had intended to go into action on foot as at Squasamus, but the heat was so oppressive that I found that I should be quite unable to run up and down the line and supervise matters unless I was mounted. I could also see the men much better, and just as important, they could see me much better. It was so hot that both the lieutenants of B Troop were overcome by heat. Both Sergeants Campbell and Davidson took their units forward splendidly. The colored 9th unit was immediately in front of us, and the 1st Regiment on the left. We all went up Kettle Hill together. I got within 40 yards of the top of Kettle Hill and ran into a wire fence. I then had to dismount my horse, Little Texas, turning him loose. He'd been scraped by a couple of bullets, one of which had nicked my elbow, and I never expected to see him again. As I ran up, Bardshar stopped to shoot, and 2 Spaniards fell as he emptied his magazine. This was the only Spaniards I actually saw fall, because of shots aimed by my men, with the exception of 2 guerrillas in the trees. Almost immediately, the hill was covered by troops, both Rough Riders and the colored troopers of the 9th, and some men of the 1st. All had fought valiantly. On top of the hill, there was a huge iron kettle. I suppose it was used for refining sugar. Several of our men took shelter behind it. We had a splendid view of San Juan Hill blockhouse to our left. I could see the infantry of Kent, led by Hawkins, were climbing the hill. Obviously, the proper thing to do was to help them. I got my men together and we began volley firing against the Spaniards in the San Juan blockhouse and the trenches that were surrounding it. Stevens was directed not only his colored troops, but a number of Rough Riders as well. For in a battle, soldiers are always prompt to recognize a good officer and are eager to follow him. The infantry got closer and closer to the crest of the hill. At last we could see the Spaniards running from the rifle pits as the Americans came in their final rush. I stopped my men from firing for fear of injuring their comrades. Thinking that my men would all follow me, I jumped over the wire fence and started running for the San Juan Hill. But the troops were so excited with the shooting and the shouting that they did not see or hear me advance. I saw after running about 100 yards that I had only 5 men with me. Bullets were ripping the grass all around us. One of my men, Clay Green, was mortally wounded, and another, Winslow Clark, a Harvard man, was shot in the leg and then through his body. He only asked that I leave his canteen where he could reach it, which I did, and he did later recover. I left the 3 other men in place to hold the ground while I retrieved the rest of my men. I ran back to them filling with anger until I realized that they did not even know I had advanced. They, of course, were quite innocent of any wrongdoing. It was all I could do not to smile at the look of injury and surprise that came over their faces while they cried out, "We didn't hear you. We didn't see you go. Colonel, lead us on now. We will follow you." We then crossed the wide valley, advancing onto San Juan Hill and the Spanish entrenchments. When we reached the entrenchments, there were many bodies all around. They had little holes in their heads, and their brains were oozing out. We figured out that as we were firing upon them, all we could see was their heads. It was at this place that 2 Spaniards jumped out of the trench not 10 yards in front of me and fired at us. I shot back with my revolver, which had been salvaged from the Maine, and missed one and shot and killed the other. The Spaniards offered much resistance as they retreated. We pursued them until we came upon a hill which was overlooking Santiago. We went back and dug in on San Juan Hill, foraging for food and waiting for supplies, expecting a Spanish counterattack, which never came. The Spanish surrendered on July 17th, ending the war. We not only liberated Cuba, but also took possession of Guam, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico, making them U.S. territories. On August the 7th, we left Cuba and headed for Miami, returning to the United States. Our regimental flag was furled on September 7th, and the Rough Riders were mustered out.
Yet, the Negro is loyal to his country. Oh, he is noble, citizen, loyal and true, forgetting that he is ostracized, his race considered as dumb as driven cattle, yet as loyal as true men, he answered the call to arms with blinding tears in his eyes and sobs as he goes forth. He sings, "My country 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty." And through the words liberty chokes him, he swallowed it and finished the stanza of "I Sing." Chaplain George Washington, the 9th Cavalry, Buffalo Soldiers, April 1898. My name is Albert Smith, and I'm a Buffalo Soldier. My first objective is to share with you the story of the Buffalo Soldiers' role during the Spanish-American War that occurred between April 25th, 1898 and August 13th, 1898. My second objective is to tell you my personal story, before I became a Buffalo Soldier. I'm a proud member of the Army's 9th Infantry Regiment, or the Buffalo Soldiers. My third objective is to tell you the story about the Buffalo Soldiers' efforts to accomplish a double V during joining the American fight against the Spanish boys in Cuba. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the Buffalo Soldiers. Buffalo Soldiers were Negro cavalrymen who served in the Army's all-colored 9th, 10th, 12th, and 25th regiments. We got our names from fighting against the Comanche Indian tribe. The Comanche told us our hair was like buffalo hair, and they began to call us the Buffalo Soldiers. The Comanche tribe lived in mostly northwestern Texas, eastern New Mexico, and southwestern Colorado. We were mainly enlisted men led by white officers who did not always believe in our fighting ability. Many of the earlier Buffalo Soldiers were former slaves who thought joining the Army would give them a job to support themselves and their families. The Army sent us all over the Southwest to protect white settlers from different Indian tribes who fought to hold on to their ancestral lands. After the American Indian Wars, the Army sent the 9th Regiment to help sort out problems between different settlers during the Johnson County War of 1892. I want to tell you a few things about myself. I was born around 1862, 1863 on the Smith Plantation around Georgetown, Kentucky. I do not know for sure what year, since the plantation owners did not always keep accurate records of the birth and death of slaves. My daddy says that our owner was pretty good for a white man, since he did not always sell slave families and break them apart. So our family was able to stay together. Becoming exodusters. After the war, the Civil War, my parents took me and my brothers and sisters to join the exodus of black slaves seeking to become farmers in Kansas. My folks said an important colored man named Pap Singleton was an influential leader who the former slaves called the leader of the exodusters who sought to farm in northwestern Kansas. Mr. Singleton heard about President Lincoln's signing of the Homestead Act of 1862, granting Americans 160 acres if they worked the land for 5 years. More important, Mr. Singleton told colored folks that the Homestead Act was not just for white settlers, but for colored folks who were willing to work the land and get a family farm. In 1877, colored folks believing in the promised land moved from Georgetown to Nicodemus. My grandfather was one of the 13 colored men who helped establish Nicodemus Colored Settlement. I grew up working with my daddy and my brothers, working on our grandfather's farm. We had hogs, chicken, and a few cattle. My grandfather said we were better off than most colored folk and better off than some white folks. My granddaddy wanted his grandsons to become educated, and he sent me back to Kentucky to attend Fisk University, which was an elite colored college. I had to leave Fisk after a couple of years when the bank took my grandfather's farm and we moved to Hill City, where he and my dad worked as cleaners in a hotel. Becoming a Buffalo Soldier. I joined the Army at age 17 and they signed me to the Buffalo Soldiers 9th Division. Most colored troops knew that the white officers didn't want coloreds to be officers, but they gave me my respect, the colored troops, and called me lieutenant. After the Johnson County War, the Army sent the 9th and the 25th back to Leavenworth, Kansas. I wanted to get married and met a local girl, and then I found out about, like all Americans, the Spanish blowing up the naval ship Maine in Cuban waters. I stayed with the 9th with hopes I would be sent to fight Cuba. Attitudes toward the war in the colored community were mixed. Most Negroes agreed with Chaplain George Washington's view of how the Negroes should support the Americans during the war to free Cuba. We thought we would gain a double victory for our support of the war. Help America get victory over defeating Spain's oppression of the Cubans. Second, to help Negroes in America gain a victory over the oppressed state that we lived in. Like many Buffalo soldiers, I didn't care too much for fighting against the Spanish or the Indians, but we were Americans and we followed our country's call. Getting ready for Cuba. True enough, the Army sent the 9th, 25th down to San Antonio, Texas to get ready for the trip to Tampa, Florida, where we were expected to board ships to Cuba. Sometimes we tried to go to bars around Tampa area to let off some steam before making the trip to Cuba. The local white folks did not want to see colored troops walking around with guns, and they put pressure on the Army to keep us restricted to our base. Not to be undone, white troops in our units wanted to fight us when we came to town. Finally, the Army put us on ships for Cuba. We're in the fight. The Army sent 17,000 men to fight the Spanish, and 3,000 of those soldiers were Buffalo soldiers. Colonel Roosevelt and his Rough Riders did not want us around too much, since they didn't think the colored troops would fight hard to win the war against the Spanish. The future president and his troops changed their minds when we played a significant role in helping secure victories against the Spanish boys on San Juan Hill and Las Camasas. Many Buffalo soldiers died in these battles. After the war, the Army recommended that 5 colored troops from the 10th were awarded the Medal of Honor, which is the country's highest military honor. In comparison, 25 other colored troops won certificates of merit medals for their actions in Cuba. No victory at home. Colonel Roosevelt praised the colored troops fighting the building, but he later referred to us as shirkers when he became president. Buffalo soldiers came home were lynched in their uniforms by angry white mobs. In several southern states, job options for the veterans were few and far between. We still wait for the double victory. Thank you.
My name is Dan McMurray, and tonight I want to talk to you about a man whose name has been associated with Missouri for several decades. Although he was not born in Missouri, and as far as I can find, he was never lived in Missouri. He was born in New Hampshire and lived several places during his lifetime, both in the States and overseas. I'm talking about General Leonard Wood. Leonard Wood was born on October 9th, 1860 in Winchester, New Hampshire, to Charles and Carolyn Hager Wood. His father, Charles, had attended Harvard Medical School and became a doctor, and Leonard followed in his father's footsteps and obtained a medical degree from Harvard in 1883. But by 1885, he had decided to take a position as a contract surgeon with the U.S. Army. That meant that he was a civilian physician working for the United States Army. His first assignment was at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, and while he was there, he participated in the last campaign against Geronimo. During this time period, he was able to get a commission as an Army officer and was awarded the Medal of Honor for his gallantry during the campaign against Geronimo. From 1887 to 1898, he served in a number of medical positions. The last was as the personal physician for President William McKinley and his family. When the Spanish-American War started in 1898, Wood sought a line command and was given command of the 1st Volunteer Cavalry, otherwise known as the Rough Riders. His second in command was the more famous Theodore Roosevelt. While Wood was the commander of the Rough Riders, most of his time was spent detailed to higher headquarters, leaving Roosevelt to lead the Rough Riders. Before the war ended, Wood commanded the 2nd Cavalry Brigade and would command it to the end of the war. After the shooting stopped and the troops began to return to the United States, Wood remained in Cuba as the military governor for the island from 1900 to 1902. In that position, he instituted a number of political, social, and educational reforms. He also worked to improve the medical and sanitary conditions on the island. Before leaving Cuba, he received his first star as a brigadier general in the regular army. After returning from Cuba in 1902, Wood served in several leadership positions, to include commander of the Philippine Division and commander of the Department of the East. In 1910, he was named Chief of Staff of the Army, the only medical officer ever to serve in that position. While serving as Army Chief of Staff, General Wood worked to strengthen the general staff and to firmly established that the Chief of Staff was a senior officer of the Army. He was instrumental in developing the Maneuver Division and in the Mobile Army concept. The reforms resulted in the Army being a truly combined armed force. And this allowed the Army to fight as a combined force in the battles and campaigns of World War I. Throughout his career, he was an advocate of military preparedness and training. He wanted military training in the colleges and universities, and he laid the foundation for the Reserve Officer Training Corps, ROTC. When the United States entered World War I, General Wood trained the 89th and the 10th divisions. By training the 89th Division, General Wood had a connection with Missouri because the 89th was made up of men from Missouri and Kansas when it was first organized. After the war, he was a candidate for a Republican nomination for president. However, the Republican convention deadlocked and the party chose a compromise candidate, which was Warren Harding, who went on to be elected in 1920. General Wood retired from the Army in 1921 and then became Governor General of the Philippines. He held that position until 1927. He died in Boston, Massachusetts on August the 7th of 1927 following unsuccessful surgery for a brain tumor. Now, the Sons of American Revolution supports the history explorers, and we like to always try to make a connection to the American Revolution. General Wood's grandfather, Eli Wood, served during the American Revolution in the Massachusetts Continental Line for 3 years as a private.
Hello, I'm Major General Arthur Macarthur. I was born in 1845 in Massachusetts to a family of relatively affluent political means. My father was active in political matters, and he was a judge. My grandfather was a veteran of the American Revolution, and as a result of the stories I heard about my grandfather, I had a great interest in the military. And so as a young man, I entered West Point. When I was 17 years old, the Civil War broke out, and when the Civil War broke out, I volunteered to go fight for the Union cause. I saw a great battle, many places. The most important for me was probably the Battle of Missionary Ridge. The Battle of Missionary Ridge put me in a position where the leaders of our unit had fallen away, and it was up to me to pick up the battle flag and lead the rest of the troops into battle, which I did. And as a result of that, at the age of 18, I earned the Congressional Medal of Honor. I fought in additional campaigns, the Atlanta campaign, and I sort of met my end at the Battle of Franklin, where I received several serious injuries, so I no longer fought in the Civil War. Following the Civil War, there were about 20 years of less activity. I was dispatched to several posts around the U.S., primarily as the Indian fighter. One of the posts I had was in working with General Leonard Wood as we attacked Geronimo and tried to put he and his tribe in a position of complete surrender and taking him as captive. This went on for 16 to 18 years as we cleaned up the Southwest. I was posted in Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico. Near the end of the century, in 1898, the Spanish-American War broke out, and I volunteered for service to be posted in a position where there was great activity. Well, that was pretty easily done because there was a need for officers at that time, and I was sent to the Philippines. Whereas the Spanish-American War was fought in many places. It initially began in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines were all involved in the fighting. My time was primarily spent in the Philippines. After Admiral Dewey steamed into the Philippines and declared victory in Manila Harbor, after having taken after suffering no casualties and after taking no prisoners, it was left up to the infantry to go ashore and to actually win that battle, which is exactly what I did. My men went on to the shores of the Philippines not knowing what we would be needing. We met men there who had helped us win the war against the Spanish, because they thought that after we won the war against the Spanish that we would turn over the Philippines to them. But that wasn't the case, because the Philippines were too important to us to surrender at that time. So our fight then, after the Spanish surrendered, was then the Philippine War, which was made much more difficult because Admiral Dewey had given the Filipinos a great deal of armament and arms to fight the Spanish with, which they now turned on the Americans. So we had to fight in sort of this terrible warfare in the jungles, because they knew that a frontal assault would be devastating for them. What their young Emilio Aguinaldo knew was that he could wear us down by sniping at us through the jungles, and that's exactly what they did. It was only after we had a series of battles that we won, using primarily very seasoned Indian war fighters to sort of flush them out, that we made much headway. We were operating under an unusual general order. President Lincoln had put into place General Order 100. General Order 100 would allow you to kill anyone who did not appear to be in support of the Americans, or who did not identify themselves in that manner. I felt that that was not a way to pursue the war, so my efforts then became one of sort of an effort to convince them that what they needed to do was to work with the Americans, so that whenever we finished our hostile period of time, we could put them into positions of power, which we did. As we had men come over to our side, then we would put them in charge of various municipal positions throughout the islands, so that they knew that they would be taking control, and that we would have some sort of a peaceful settlement. Taking this lenient position was not very popular, but I felt like the right thing to do was to work with these young revolutionaries to help regain control of their island, so that in the future, even though we wanted to maintain it as an American territory, we would have a peaceful partnership with them. Following the end of this Philippine War, which took another year, and over 299 conflicts in that 1 year, we came to a peaceful settlement. Eventually, the Philippines were purchased from Spain, and we determined that there was a settlement there of all dispute with the Filipinos. After the war, I was put in charge as military governor, and we found that there was a period of peaceful coexistence thereafter. I would like to thank you all for watching this program on the Spanish-American War, brought to you by the Sons of the American Revolution. I'd like to thank Jeff Patrick for giving our introduction this evening, for Dan McMurray talking about General Leonard Wood, Dr. Gilbert Brown for bringing us a very interesting story and highlights of the life of the Buffalo Soldier as he worked in the Spanish-American War. Gary Gift, who talked to us about the most interesting character, Teddy Roosevelt. And we hope that you have found something of interest in these programs, and that you, in fact, will go pick up a library book and that you will become a history explorer along with us. Thank you.